To understand the Great Recession, the great economic financial crisis that began in 2007 and is still very much with us, we need, I think, to start with two fundamental points. First, the crisis is incomprehensible as a short-term development. It has deep historical roots going back more than 3 decades. Second, although the crisis has, of course, been highlighted by the spectacular financial meltdown of 2007-2008, it expresses at bottom profound problems in the productive economy on a world scale. Put another way, the great crisis of the financial sector grew out of difficulties in the real economy. Now, the post-war epoch naturally divides itself into 2 distinct eras. First, we had, of course, the long post-war boom from the 1940s to the early 1970s, which brought the fastest, most impressive growth in the history of capitalism. But from 1973 into the present, we've had something quite different, what I would call the long downturn, characterized by much slower growth of GDP, investment, productivity, and employment. In fact, since 1973, the advanced capitalist countries have experienced ever worsening economic performance, decade by decade, business cycle by business cycle, right into the present. Not accidentally, the business cycle that ran from early 2001 to the end of 2007 and culminated in the Great Recession witnessed by far the worst economic performance of the post-war epoch. What then was it that lay behind this long downturn? I would argue that it's found its fundamental cause in a major fall in the rate of profit, not only in the US, but throughout the advanced capitalist economies. This fall in the rate of profit was itself the result of a persistent tendency to overcapacity in global manufacturing industries, which reaches as far back as the later 1960s. Essentially what's happened is that one after another, newly emerging economic power has been able to make use of the latest technology in combination with relatively low wages to manufacture for export goods that were already being produced for the world market, but to do so at a lower price. First Germany and Japan, then the East Asian NICs, especially Korea and Taiwan, and finally the great Chinese Leviathan. To make matters worse, the great corporations that were already in the market refused to politely cede the field to their new rivals, but did their best to counterattack. The result has been a profound intensification of international competition, growing overcapacity, and a downward squeeze on profits in world manufacturing industries. Put another way, the problems of the economy have arisen in the first instance from globalization, specifically globalization in international manufacturing and the pressure on prices and profits that it's brought with it. Now, in the face of and in response to downward pressure on their profit rates, corporations have had 2 main responses. First, since falling profitability meant that they were getting lower returns from any given investment in plant and equipment and labor power, corporations have reduced incentives to invest. So they've cut back on their purchases of new plant and equipment and also on hiring of additional workers, making for the slower growth of investment and employment. Second, and perhaps most spectacularly, in order to restore their profits, corporations have unleashed a relentless assault on the wages, salaries, working conditions, and organizations of working people that has continued to this day. In this, they've been aided by governments around the world, which have reduced the growth of social services, the welfare state, and made the survival of unions ever more difficult. The upshot has been that ever since the early 70s, you've had essentially ever greater austerity in aid of the recovery of profitability. And this has resulted in the long-term stagnation of working class incomes and the historic increases in income inequality that are today finally making the news. One chilling example that typifies the trend. According to a Brookings study published early this year, in 2009, the median income of a full-time male worker in the United States, adjusted for inflation, was roughly the same as, get this, 1969. In other words, there's been no gain in real wages for 40 years. And to make matters worse, since 2009, the median income has fallen by a further 7%. It should be added that U.S. corporations, in contrast to those in certain other of the advanced capitalist economies, adopted two further distinctive strategies to respond to the downward pressures in profits in manufacturing. First, they stepped up their production overseas, offshoring as it's called, to combine their advanced techniques where possible with lower wage labor. Almost all of the great U.S. corporations today have at least half of their production in other countries. The other characteristic response of U.S. firms to problems of making profits in production has been the turn to financial services that we're all familiar with. That leading firms such as GE and GM have moved such a large part of their total investment into finance, especially consumer lending, basically tells the story. The bottom line is that the financial sector in the U.S. has accounted for an ever greater proportion of total GDP, investment, and above all, total corporate profits, and on that basis exerted ever greater influence on the polity. Nevertheless, the fact remains that corporations' slowdown in capital accumulation, and in particular their holding down of workers' incomes, has tended to prove self-defeating. This is because it's brought about the slowed growth of demand, thus the stagnation of the corporation's own markets. The flip side, so to speak, of slowing investment and employment, and especially the stagnation of worker incomes, has thus been the stagnation of aggregate demand all across the capitalist economies. And it's been the continuing weakness of aggregate demand that has posed the main problem in keeping the economy growing, keeping it turning over. Now, all else equal, downward pressure on aggregate demand could have been expected to result in serious economic crisis a long time ago. The reason it didn't was that governments have tried to solve the basic problem through various forms of fiscal and monetary stimulus, basically making possible the growth of borrowing and debt in various increasingly baroque forms. The idea, of course, to make up for the demand that wasn't being brought about in the economy itself. In the 1970s and 1980s, attempts to stimulate the economy took the form of Keynesian deficit spending by governments, tax cuts, and spending increases. But for reasons I don't have time to discuss, this really didn't work. So starting in the 1990s, the Federal Reserve sought to keep the economy turning over through the bizarre means of nurturing asset price bubbles. The idea was to use very low interest rates to force up asset prices, and in this way to allow the owners of those assets to borrow more so as to invest or consume, and in that way to push up demand and drive the economy. The first experiment in what might be called asset price Keynesianism led, of course, to the great high-tech stock market run-up of the later 1990s. For a time, this enabled corporations to borrow against their inflated stock values and use the proceeds to finance a major investment boom. But since profits didn't rise to match the rising prices of equities, in fact they fell, we got the stock market crash of 2000-2001 and the ensuing recession. To pull the economy out of the recession, Alan Greenspan's super low interest rates starting just after the turn of the century made it possible for housing prices to rise as never before. Households were thus enabled to borrow against their increasing home equity, and for a number of years they were able on this basis to drive the economy forward with their hyped up consumption. But since there was little growth in employment or wages between 2000 and 2007, the housing bubble could not but end up in the crash of the housing market, with a huge swath of the working class either losing their homes or outright or burdened with a massive amount of debt. That debt has put a huge damper on the growth of household expenditure and has been a major factor in preventing any notable recovery since the crash. Of course, as we know, very much exacerbating matters, the country's banks had securitized mortgages by the thousands, packaged them together, and sold them to investors or held onto them themselves. As a consequence, when the mortgage market collapsed, it brought profound crisis not only to the country's working class, but to the financial sector itself, notably the great banks. The ultimate outcome was, of course, the Great Recession, in which we still very much find ourselves today. And no closer, I might add, than before to the solution of the problem of overcapacity in manufacturing. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Okay. To speak to the question of what is to be done about the crisis, we obviously have to pose a further clarifying question, that of agency. That is, what is to be done by whom and for whom? Unfortunately, those agents who have the wherewithal to really affect the crisis are pretty clearly making it worse by acting in their own interests. Those who have an interest in countering the crisis and transcending it and making things better for the 99%, so to speak, are so far without the capacity to affect very much. The great banks, which were of course bailed out to the tune of $12 trillion, are not as a result expressing their apologies for getting us into this mess, or their gratitude to the government and American citizens for saving them. Why are we not surprised? On the contrary, they are resisting with all their might new regulations that might limit their risky behavior in the future and hold them responsible for that. Given their extraordinary weight within the political system, not least with our leading politicians, finance is as likely as not to actually win out and keep the citizenry hostage to their bad behavior. The leading corporations are continuing with the same strategy that they've been pursuing in the US for a good while. That is, they're taking an unprecedentedly large share of total corporate output in the form of profits and leaving an unprecedentedly small share to labor. The result, as we've already noted, is to undermine demand for their own goods, leading them, as before, to refrain from doing much investing or hiring or raising wages, a long familiar vicious cycle that leads corporations to seek an even more skewed distribution of their product. To make matters worse, in most of the greatest of these companies are heavily oriented to international production and or finance. So they have no great passion for the big spending programs on infrastructure, health, and education that was for so long in the interest of and demanded by US manufacturers as they rose to the leading place in world production from, say, the 1790s through the 1950s. Just look at California. Republican politicians are, of course, demanding greater austerity, gargantuan tax breaks to the corporations and the rich, further deregulation, and more thorough destruction of the unions. This is not what's needed to deal with the economic crisis. But we can say that only if your top priority is a more dynamic economy, more employment, and better working and living standards for US working people. But that is obviously not the Republicans' priority, which can also be boiled down to preventing things from getting better to ensure that the defeat of Obama. What about the Democratic Party politicians, supposedly very different from their Republican rivals? If you took the program of the Progressive Caucus within the Democratic Party as representative of it, and the Progressive Caucus as actually fighting for their program, you might be able to make a case that the Democrats were quite different and that we might be able to see some positive change on the agenda. But as we know, the center of gravity within the Democratic Party is de facto on the party's center right, represented by people like President Obama and before him President Clinton. It is hardly radical or heretical today to note that from this perspective, what the Democrats who count really want, is something like what was put forward by Simpson-Bowles, or the president himself. The Simpson-Bowles Budget Commission, you may remember, cut the deficit, or the president himself in his grand compromise, to focus on reducing the deficit in no small part by cutting entitlements. The result of their leadership has already been a de facto reduction in spending, made much worse by the reduction in social spending taking place at the state and local level. So we're getting from the Democratic Party de facto, not in rhetoric, but de facto, a continuation not of stimulus, but a new contraction. In the run-up to the election that is starting now, Obama is likely to put forward limited measures to stimulate the economy. But we should remember that they've all been, as Obama himself has said, they've all been previously embraced by past Republican parties and will not in any case be allowed to pass by the current Republican Party. The one socio-political force that is actually devoted to Keynesian demand management, a broad program of expansion, of investment in infrastructure, education, health, and so forth, is of course organized labor, the unions. Unfortunately, the unions have managed to deprive themselves of practically any influence at all in the American polity by adopting as their chief strategy getting Democrats elected. This has sadly allowed the Democratic Party to take them for granted, and they do a fantastic job at election time for the Democrats, and thus de facto to ignore them. Since the unions are totally dependent on the Democrats really don't feel any need to bow to their needs. Where does this leave us? If you asked me this question 6 weeks ago, the answer would have had to be depressed. Very depressed. But what we've had exploding onto the scene since then is, of course, Occupation Wall Street. Occupation Wall Street. The genius of OWS has been to portray themselves as speaking for the 99%. It couldn't be more obvious that virtually every element within the establishment has made clear that it doesn't want to or is unable to act in the interest of that 99%. They've been able to get away with it to a large extent, not because we don't know what the 99% want, there's plenty of polls, but because they've basically been able to control the conversation. Yet, as I say, the actual 99% could not be clearer that they find the stasis in favor of the top 1% quite unacceptable. It turns out, for that reason, that already, in the latest polls, 57% of those polled support Occupation Wall Street across the country. In New York City, it's something like 75%. Just to close, I would say, this is not the OWS is not just making a propaganda coup, which of course they are, but they have done something quite different from previous movements coming out of similar strata, you might say. They've looked from the beginning and made it crystal clear that they look to the working class as a whole as the power base to make changes and whose interest they want to organize. In New York, this has already resulted in turning some of the hidebound unions into much more exciting organizations, and the unions have in turn tried to help build OWS. If Occupation Wall Street and the labor movement can begin to cross-fertilize with one another and drive each other upward, maybe we'll have a serious force that can offer an agency for the programs that I think the 99%, including most of the people in this room, actually want.